welcome. Good evening, and welcome to this Brill lecture. We are extremely pleased to have here Rachel Zelnick-Abramovitz. No, I didn't actually. This is how you pronounce your name. Yeah. I didn't ask you. Rachel Zelnick-Abramovitz, who is not unknown to the cluster because she is on our advisory board and has been since the beginning. Yes. Yes, more or less. Yes. So we should say thank you, Rachel, because of course you were then crucial to our successful securing a second funding phase, having accompanied us so well during the first phase. Rachel is a Professor Emerita of Classics and at Tel Aviv University, where you also taught, I think, for your entire
I taught everything.
Yes.
I think that was needed.
Yes. Yes, at Tel Aviv University in the Department of Classics, where she also completed her PhD in 1996 before starting at Tel Aviv as a lecturer and then finishing as a Professor Emerita. I couldn't find out when you actually retired. Maybe.
Oh, it's 2021.
In 2021, exactly. Rachel is an expert in ancient Greek society, especially on the relationships between citizens and non-citizens. And she works predominantly with epigraphy. Epigraphy, for those who are not ancient historians, is script inscribed on various materials, a form of communication that was important for both public and private contexts in ancient Greece. And I think the boundaries between public and private are also of your major interest. So that's one source she works with. And she works with historiography. And she has a new project she's just told me about verbs in Greek history writing, and particularly about verbs of motion and how Greek historians walk us literally through a text by saying, well, we would say, you know, now I will turn to, actually do this song, now I'll turn to, now
I'll go back to the point.
Great project, and look forward to the publication. Rachel is the author of a myriad of papers on these and other topics and of several books. She has co-edited a volume with Stefan Kohlermann and others called What is Global in Global Slavery, which came out of a conference held at Tel Aviv University. But she's also the author of a series of monographs in English and Hebrew, on which I would like to mention two, not wholly free, The Concept of Manumission and the Status of Manumitted Slaves in the Ancient Greek World. That is one, was published by Brill, and Taxing Freedom in the Thessalian Manumission Inscriptions, also with Brill in 2013. Manumission is, of course, a form of dependency between slavery and freedom, and therefore key to what we are studying here in Bonn. And these books are also directly related to the topic of Rachel's talk today, where I think you're taking a broader view rather just Greek slavery, more global view, setting ancient Greek manumission practice into a global perspective. And I think this should be of huge interest to many of us in the BCDSS. And curiously, the talk is about partially manumitted slaves, which of course further complicates this dichotomy of slavery and freedom. We're looking forward to your talk. It's so wonderful to have you here and hear about this research, partially manumitted slaves, the legal and social implications.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this kind introduction. I'm very honored to be invited to deliver the Joseph Miller Memorial Lecture at the Institute, with which, as Julia mentioned, I was connected for several years and whose work I deeply appreciate. I also think that the topic of my lecture is well suited to the center, because the evidence of it and of related practices, although sparse, as you will see, spans a wide chronological and geographical range. It includes, and sorry for this, yeah, it includes Neo-Babylonia, Judea in the first centuries CE, Roman Egypt, Thessalian Iran, Christian legal traditions, Syrian Christian traditions, Islamic jurisprudence, Jewish communities in the medieval Mediterranean, medieval Portugal, and even modern Cuba. I therefore hope that those of you who study enslavement and dependency in these regions will find it of interest and will contribute. I welcome any comment and criticism. Because although it's I also already published an article about this subject back in 2019 in Harvard Studies of Classical Philology, since then I came across further evidence, and I welcome anything you can contribute so it can be a moving or enrolling subject. Now the topic is partially manumitted slaves, or to use a more concise term, partial manumission. And I chose, you can see maybe the parts of a skeleton, because I was trying to find out something that will, an image that will demonstrate what I'm talking about. Now this phenomenon intrigued me since the first time I encountered it. It means the manumitting or the freeing of parts of slaves, that is, manumitting a half, a quarter, a third, or even other fractions of a person who is in slavery. Now, this manumission, this subject raises a number of complex questions. What motivated partial manumission? What was the position of a slave of whom one part was free while the other part remained enslaved? In practical terms, how did such a position of an enslaved person's labor work? Can economic factors, both at the broader societal level and within the private domestic sphere, explain the phenomenon? Or should we instead look to the domain of the mentalité? Another important question is whether the evidence reflects local or other practices and laws. And given the wide geographical and chronological distribution of the evidence, may we speak of shared legal and social concepts, even in the absence of direct influence? Examining the evidence may help us address these questions. It also challenges our understanding of enslavement as a system of ownership, of power relations, or both. The earliest example comes from a Neo-Babylonian document from Uruk, and you can see on the map where it is, I am marked it with an arrow, dated to 556 BCE. It records the transfer of a person between statuses. A man grants 2/3 of his enslaved person in adoption to his freedman, who is now a temple dependent, a shirku. I will explain later what it is, stipulating that after the adopter's death, the adoptee would belong entirely to the temple, that is, become a shirku. We can thus identify 3 stages in the status of Nabuina Karishu Lumo. This is the person who is given in adoption. First enslaved, then 2/3 adopted by a shirku, thus on this reading, sharing that status in 2/3 of his person, and finally a holy shirku. This case suggests that an enslaved person could be conceived as divisible property, though its interpretation depends on whether the shirku's status is closer to free or enslaved. Now, the shirkus were a class, a hereditary class of temple subordinates. They owed their labor to the temple, but could not be sold. They owned property. They had their own family. So in a way, they were closer to the status of free persons than to enslaved persons. Okay. Now we move from a Neo-Babylonian society to Judea in the first centuries CE, where rabbinic sources explicitly discuss the status of half slave, half free, understood as resulting either from partial manumission by a single owner or from the action of one of two co-owners, whether related or not. This issue is debated in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first written collection of Jewish oral traditions. And here in this text that is quoted here, the issue is debated by the rabbinic schools of Hillel and Shammai, active in the late 1st century BCE and early 1st century CE. We see that the school of Hillel accepts partial manumission, holding that the half-free, half-enslaved individual alternates between working for the master and for himself. The school of Shammai, however, rejects this arrangement, citing the religious obligation to marry and procreate. Okay, so you see that what they are saying, that the one who is half slave and half free serves his master every other day. So this is how the practical issue of how you can be partially manumitted works. Now, the Babylonian Talmud, and the Talmud, do you know what is, should I explain? Okay, the Talmud is the main source of ancient Jewish law. And it includes also the Mishnah, which we saw earlier, and also the commentaries on the Mishnah. So we have two Talmuds. One was written in Palestine, so it's called the Jerusalem Talmud, and one was written in Babylonia, so it's the Babylonian Talmud. The issue is also debate. So we see that the Babylonian Talmud here further illustrates the legal complications, for example, in discussing the compensation due when such a person, half slave, half free, is gored by an ox. If it occurs on a day belonging to the master receives compensation. If on the day belonging to the half slave, half free, the half free, his heirs receive it. Now, such discussions, and there are numerous in the Mishnah and the Talmud, I argue, are not merely theoretical, but reflect real cases, as suggested by the example cited in 1843b. As the debate indicates here, one concern behind the rulings was to prevent exploitation of enslaved women for prostitution. Now I give here, I cite a few scholars on the subject, but mainly to show you how scholars try to understand it, modern scholars. Now Ephraim Orbach, the second cited here, rightly observed that the numerous Mishnah regulations show that the status of half slave, half free was neither abolished nor intended to be abolished by the school of Shammai's ruling that we saw earlier. He also followed Ostersetzer, the first one cited here, in linking these regulations to the slave's right to property, arguing that partial manumission created a kind of partnership between the half-free individual and the owner. Also, Ostersetzer further maintained, on the basis of Egyptian Greek papyri, which I will discuss shortly, that this arrangement reflected Greek law and contrasted with Roman law, where the slave was a res, as a thing, and thus incapable of owning property. He therefore concluded that partial manumission occurs only in systems where slaves could hold property. However, this argument confuses ownership with the widespread Greek and Roman practice of allowing trusted slaves to retain and use part of their earnings. Moreover, beyond the problematic notion of Greek law, the papyri cannot be taken to reflect any unified legal system. I will return to this issue after discussing the Greek Egyptian papyri, to which I now turn. The Egyptian papyri relating to partial manumission are few but more detailed. The first text here on the screen is a manumission record from which I cite only a few lines. It tells about Achilleus and Sarapas, two brothers from Oxyrhynchos in Egypt. They manumitted their share in an enslaved woman, her name was Apollonius, amounting to 1/3, which they hold in equal parts. That is, each of the brothers, has 1/6 of Apollonius. The remaining 2/3 had already been freed, although the agent of that manumission is not specified. The second text here, 3b, is a request made by the guardians of 3 minors, 2 sisters and their brother, asking for the public auction of their inherited share in a slave. Eudaimonis, the girl, holds 1/6. Dionysios and Thyasis together 1/2, that is 2/6 together. And their half-brother Diogenes 1/3, which he had already manumitted. At the time of this document, therefore, the enslaved person, whose name is Serapion, was already free in 1/3 of his person. And the proposed auction meant that the successful bidder would be the owner of only 2/3 of the Serapion, which is also a question, why would anyone buy only 2/3 of a slave? We don't know. Now, the third text of a much later date is a letter from a woman named Aurelia Teroteru of Elephantine to 3 enslaved persons she inherited from her mother, acknowledging the manumission of her share in them. The letter does not specify the size of her share or the status of the remaining portions, but it clearly attests to partial manumission. Taken together, these 3 papyri are the only explicit attestations of partial manumission in Egypt. Yet, their matter-of-fact language, together with the broader context of the practice, suggests that it may have been more widespread than the surviving evidence indicates. Manumission parts, as we see here, often resulted from joint ownership, either among relatives through inheritance or among non-relatives formed for profit, with slaves used in business or prostitution. And in A and B, I cite a few cases just to show you joint ownership by relatives, by non-relatives, and some of them uncertain. Such joint ownership was prone to legal disputes, since sale of slaves or manumission reduced the common patrimony. For this reason, consent from all potential heirs was often required in advance, though disputes nevertheless occurred. These cases illuminate how slaves were actually held and used by co-owners. For example, a case that is not quoted here, but I cite it from down here, from an archive, a family archive from Tebtunis in Egypt, number 37, 38, and 40. They describe three brothers, Lysimachos, Philosorapis, and Philantinos, who jointly owned the enslaved woman Martilla. She lived on their estate and supplied them from the distance. A dispute arose when Philantinos secretly used her as surety for a loan. His brothers, of course, objected, while he claimed to have pledged only his 1/3 share. The creditor ultimately seized Martilla, either treating the pledge as covering the entire person, or because partial seizure was impossible. To avoid such complications, co-owners, especially siblings, often agreed on a formal division of property, which is called in Greek the irises, which is down there. That is, they decided in advance who gets what share. Now, the evidence from Judea and Egypt derives from the Roman period, raising the question of the extent to which it reflects Roman legal practice. Now, Roman jurists rejected partial manumission, perhaps to avoid the kind of legal complications evident in Jewish and Egyptian sources. In classical Roman law, an intermediate status between slavery and freedom was inadmissible. A person was either free or enslaved. Accordingly, jurists held that if one co-owner manumitted his share by a formal act, that is the method which was acceptable by the Roman law, it's called vindicta or by testament. If he manumitted his share by a formal act, that share accrued to the remaining owner through the jus acquiescendi, or the right of survivorship. Be that as it may, the numerous regulations concerning the servus communis, the slave who has many owners, suggest that, as in the Jewish sources, the Roman jurists were addressing legal problems arising from real cases. As I argued earlier, it is unwarranted to infer from certain Greek features in the Egyptian manumission documents the Greekness of partial manumission. Despite being written in Greek, the underlying concept in Egypt appears to have been local, or at least regional, because in Greek, in the Greek world, we don't have any evidence of partial manumission. So the papyri, although written in Greek, reflect Egyptian or local practice. And we can see it from our next example, or our next case. We move to Sasanian Iran. A compilation of legal cases and decisions, which is called the Book of 1000 Judgment, dated to the first half of the 7th century CE, provides valuable evidence on slavery in Sasanian Iran. 3 passages suggest that partial manumission was a recognized practice. The first passage shows that an enslaved person could be freed not only in halves, but also in smaller fractions. Yeah, you see here 1/10 of a slave. In the second passage, a man who is half free and half enslaved dies without an heir, requiring the appointment of a steward, that is, a person tasked with providing a successor. The third text describes a person of a divided status, 1/2 freed, 1/3 transferred to the ownership of a deity, and 1/6 remaining enslaved to the manumitter. In these texts, partial manumission results from the division of ownership by a single master, single owner. Though another passage, which I didn't quote but I cite here, shows that it could also arise from when one of 2 co-owners manumitted his share. While the Sasanian sources treat the practice as ordinary, its underlying motives motives remain uncertain. By this period, slaves were a central productive force in Thessalian society, numerous and employed in households, agriculture, often tied to the land, and temples. Apart from their scale, these patterns of slaveholding do not differ markedly for those in Egypt, Judea, or Neo-Babylonia. Partial manumission may therefore have arisen from economic considerations or inheritance constraints. Now, the parallels between these Thessalian texts and concepts in the Babylonian Talmud are probably not coincidental. Scholarship has increasingly situated the Babylonian Talmud within its Thessalian and Zoroastrian context, noting legal and terminological affinities. Given the broader cultural connections, it is reasonable to consider a similar correspondence in the case of partial manumission, as suggested, for example, by Janusz Jani, cited here in the bottom of the screen. In the same region, among East Syrian Christians communities, another legal text refers to partial manumission. This is the Book of Laws composed by the Archbishop Ishobokt around 775 to 779 CE. Although originally written in Persian, it has survived only in Syrian translations. And I use the English translation of the Syrian. The first passage states that if a person declares free his share in slaves jointly owned with others, that is, as a collective, then all the portions of the slaves included in his share become free. That is, if he has only a third of all, let's say, of 99 slaves, or something like that, then a third of each one of the slaves become free. However, if he declares that all the slaves to whom he is entitled according to his share, that now I follow the same example, that 33 slaves which are in his share, they are all become free. But the co-owners had to divide the slaves by lot. Now, the second passage here further stipulates that partially freed slaves may work for themselves in the portion that has been manumitted and may acquire property for their own benefit, and I quote, insofar as they are free. Ishobokt also notes that in certain places, if the owner of 1/2 or 1/3 of a slave manumits his share, the remaining co-owners are required to accept the price of the slave and grant full manumission, which appears to echo Roman legal principles. But at the same time, there is a striking resemblance between the legal concepts expressed here and those found in the Book of Thousand Judgment that we saw earlier, as well as in some respects, in the Jewish Mishnah. Ishobokt seems to have drawn primarily on traditional Zoroastrian jurisprudence rather than adopting the laws of the Christian Roman Empire. This approach has been described by Uriel Simonson, which I quoted here at the bottom, as legal pluralism, a framework which, he argues, helps explain how Christian and Jewish authorities issued rulings within a context of competing and overlapping judicial systems. A similar concept existed among the Western Syrian Christians, as evidenced in the Synodicon, a collection of ecclesiastical and civil laws in which partial manumission is discussed within the context of inheritance law. The manuscript is dated to the year 1204, but the compiler notes that the materials it contains span a much earlier period, ranging from what he said, the apostolic canons and the laws of the Greek kings and Arab rulers. A statement that does not provide any firm evidence regarding the date or place of origin of this document. According to Simonson, again, Oriel Simonson, civil law within West Syrian jurisprudence was shaped by both Roman and Islamic legal traditions. It is to the Islamic traditions that we now turn. So we fly across the world and the time. The first passage cited here is taken from the Hadith, the corpus of traditions reporting the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad as transmitted by various narrators. Here, Ibn Umar reports that Muhammad stated that anyone who manumits his share in a slave must compensate the other co-owners for their respective shares. Only if he lacks sufficient means may he manumit the slave partially, in proportion to his ownership. Thus, although full freedom was preferred, partial manumission was recognized, and the various schools of Islamic jurisprudence subsequently debated its legal validity and practical implications. The next two passages, I'll show the second in a minute, are drawn from the Hedaya, a 12th century compilation of legal rulings and traditions. Passage B here indicates that a slave could be manumitted in fractional shares, such as 1/2, 1/3, or 1/6. A distinction is made, however, between bodily parts that cannot be manumitted independently of the whole, that is the neck, the back, or the head, and the so-called diffusive portions, that is, for example, 1/2 of the slave. This issue was also subject to legal debate, as reflected in this passage from chapter 2. It's a long one, so I'll just summarize it. The discussion bears a striking resemblance to modern debates over whether slavery should be understood primarily as a relationship of domination, in which case partial manumission is possible, or as a form of property ownership. To address this complex problem, the author here compares the status of a partially manumitted slave to that of a mukatab. A mukatab is a slave who enters into a contractual agreement with his owner to obtain freedom upon payment of a fixed sum, either in installments or by giving services. The mukatab was permitted to work and engage in transactions with his own property, but could not travel or marry without the owner's consent. Children born to him during the term of the contract likewise occupied the same intermediate status. Now, the mukatab, of course, cannot be fully equated with partially manumitted slave, since no part of his person is considered completely free. Nevertheless, the Hedaya's comparison between the mukatab and the partially freed slave finds parallels in other legal traditions. Evidence from the Babylonian Talmud, the Syrian Christian legal texts, and Islamic law may point either to the emergence or to the independent emergence of similar conceptualizations of enslavement across these societies, or to a significant influence of Thessalian jurisprudence on neighboring legal systems, including Islamic law. And in light of the Neo-Babylonian and Egyptian evidence, it may therefore be possible to speak of shared legal concepts across societies of the Near East. This finds a remarkable parallel in the Jewish communities of the medieval Mediterranean, as evidenced by the Cairo Geniza. A Geniza is a storage space designated for the deposition of worn-out Hebrew language books and documents. The Genizah discovered in a synagogue in Cairo yielded some 400,000 complete manuscripts and fragments dating from the 9th to the 19th century, attesting to a society of merchants who traveled, absorbed, and circulated not only goods, but also ideas between Egypt, Spain, Sicily, Tunis, and even India. Among the documents found in the Genizah are responsa, that is, rabbinic answers to legal questions, demonstrating the prevalence of joint ownership of slaves and partial manumission among Egyptian Jews during the 12th and 13th centuries. One such document is a query addressed to Maimonides, who was a Jewish philosopher and physician born in Spain, and who emigrated in 1168 to Egypt and settled in Fustat. This is Old Cairo. He became the leader of the Jewish community there. This document of which I quote just the answer of Maimonides, preserve a complex case, which I will describe now. A man married his enslaved woman, who had 2 daughters, later recognized by him as his heirs. When he died, his brother contested the inheritance, but lost the case and compromised with his daughters. One of the daughters then died. The other was manumitted by the brother, married a Jewish man, and had children by him. So far, understood? Okay. Subsequently, it's like a soap opera. Subsequently, the daughters of another brother challenged the agreement, claiming half of the deceased uncle's estate and arguing that the maidservant's daughter remained half enslaved, and therefore so did her children. Maimonides' response, which is quoted here, was that if witnesses other than those who signed the marriage contract could testify that when this daughter was born, her mother was still in slavery and only later was manumitted and married, then the daughter would indeed be considered half enslaved, half free, as would her children, since the other heirs had not manumit their share in her. Okay. And there are other examples in the Genizah. I conclude with 2 additional examples. The first comes from medieval Portugal, where Muslim and Black slaves could be manumitted in fractional shares, half, third, or quarter portions. A slave of this intermediate status was known as maioforo, half-free. According to the 13th century judgment issued by the mayor of Lisbon in response to a legal query, this term was applied to Moorish captives whose Christian owners granted them only partial manumission. Such persons were required to pay for the remaining portions of their value in order to obtain full freedom. This does not necessarily imply that Islamic concepts of slavery were directly adopted in medieval Iberia. Nevertheless, it is possible that Muslim captives and slaves introduced modes of manumission consistent with their legal and religious traditions, and that some of these practices persisted even after the Reconquista, becoming integrated into Christian slaveholding societies alongside Roman legal forms and concepts that had also influenced the peninsula and the Christian kingdoms. And an illustration of this conceptual affinity is the aforementioned response of Maimonides, who was born in Spain and was active in Egypt. My last example is the institution, which I assume is familiar to some of you, or custom of coartación in Cuba. attested between the 16th and the 19th century. Enslaved individuals who negotiated a purchase price for their freedom and made initial payment toward full freedom were known as coartados. Some scholars regard them as partially free persons, possibly entitled to work only on specified days. This is corroborated by Article 36 of the Reglamento de la Esclavitud of 1842, which states that coartation is a personal privilege. Therefore, the children of a coartada woman are not entitled to it and may be sold, and I quote, like other complete slaves. However, the system of installment payment was understood as granting partial freedom in the sense of freeing portions of the slaves. So to conclude, first, although the evidence of its actual practice is limited, and in some cases derives from legal discussions rather than from manumission documents, partial manumission must have been real and considered conceivable to deserve legal debates, to be mentioned in a relatively casual way, and to persist in medieval and modern times. Second, partial manumission often resulted from joint ownership of slaves by family members or business partners, whether in equal or unequal shares. Economic conditions, business partnerships, and inheritance laws frequently led to the ownership of fractional shares in enslaved persons, and consequently to the manumission of these fractions. Economic hardships or legal disputes often compelled co-owners to manumit only their portion of a slave, which in turn generated further legal complications. Partly manumitted slaves may have worked for their owners a proportionate part of the week, were exempt from certain duties, or, as was likely often the case, were only nominally partly free, but in practice continued to work as if wholly enslaved. Third, partial manumission was one of various forms of manumission, most of them conditional, and in a sense perpetuating the slave's dependency. Alongside other forms of manumission, it illustrates the diversity of both freedom and enslavement, and cautions against overly rigid or clear-cut definitions. Fourth, although a single origin cannot be identified, possible connections may be discerned. The similarity between Sasanian, Talmudic, Syrian, Christian, and the Islamic practices and laws has long been noted. Comparable economic, social, and cultural conditions appear to have generated similar concerns and regulations across the Near East. This need not necessarily reflect direct cultural influence, but may point to the development of shared conceptual frameworks. Islamic practices may have spread with the Muslim conquest, so that in Portugal, and perhaps in other regions of Iberia, Muslim customs and concepts were adopted by Christian slave owners. And fifth, partial manumission highlights the dual nature of the enslaved person as both property and human being. Where economic conditions and legal circumstances required it, slave owners resorted to partial manumission because slaves conceived as items of property could be divided into shares. As human beings, they could act and transact independently with respect to their manumitted portions. And I thank you for your attention.